Welcome to this month's In Dialogue program, Smithsonian Objects and Social Justice. This is a collaborative program that is hosted by educators from the National Portrait Gallery, with this month a colleague from the Asian Pacific American Center. You will see on the screen that there is a warm-up question. As we go through our welcome, I would encourage everyone to go ahead and respond to that question in the chat, and we will revisit or visit your responses in just a few moments. To get us started, my name is Brianna White, and I am an educator at the National Portrait Gallery, and I am joined by three wonderful colleagues. Andrea.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be with you today. My name is Andrea Kim Neighbors. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the manager of education initiatives at the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center. Irina?
Hi, everyone. My name is Irina. I'm an educator at the National Portrait Gallery. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be helping out in the chat today. Ashley?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Kwan. I am the Women's History Content and Interpretation Curator at the National Portrait Gallery, she, her pronouns, and I will also be helping out in the chat box.
Excellent. Thank you. So with this program, it is our intention to explore civic awareness through conversations about art, about history, about material culture, and to discuss how historical objects and contemporary objects from our collections speak to today's social justice issues. So a couple of housekeeping things. This program is being recorded. If you turn your camera on or your microphone on, the audio or video feed from your device may be captured on the recording and used for Smithsonian purposes. Take care to conceal from view and not share material that is private, sensitive, or confidential. We will ask you to engage with us and each other using the chat box during our program this evening.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you. I put it in the chat, but I didn't get a response. How can I shut off the closed captioning? Because it interferes with the picture for me.
So thank you. So you actually just bring me right into my next point, which is that this program is being automatically transcribed. To turn the captions on or off, toggle over the CC that you see on your sort of taskbar, CC or closed caption button on your Zoom window, and you should be able to go ahead and turn them off. And Ashley went ahead and added how to do that into the chat as well. All right, with that, I am going to hand it over to Irina.
So although we are getting together today from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. We also recognize that since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. The National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. Let's also take this time to briefly acknowledge the continued impact of racism on people of color through systems of oppression and racial violence, including police brutality, public acts of xenophobia, and anti-racism. And now, before we get started, I would like to go over some community norms. So please respect others and their opinions. We are here to engage in an open discussion and exchange of ideas. We encourage listening and sharing and expect all to do so with respect. Consider your own privacy and that of others. Please do not share personal information about yourself that you would not want known by others, or personal information that you may know about others in this discussion. Please avoid inappropriate materials and statements. Cyberbullying will not be tolerated. Critique ideas, not people. Be present, passionate, and compassionate, patient and compassionate. Together, let's create a safe space. Remember that we all come to this conversation with different lived experiences, perspectives, and ideas. Even in disagreement, we can learn from each other and build community.
Thank you, Irina, for sharing that with everyone here. Hi again, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your responses to this question in the chat. We're opening up this conversation with the question, how do you know when you belong? And I know Irina has been looking at the chat. So Irina, I'm wondering if there are a couple of answers, and not answers, all answers are right answers, or if there are a couple of responses that you could share with the group.
Yeah, one word that I see coming up a lot in the chat is the word comfortable, when people feel comfortable with their surroundings, with the people around them. Let's see. Yeah, people are saying when they feel appreciated. And some people are describing how other people would be acting when they feel comfortable, whether it's a smiling person or someone who is engaging them. That is when people feel like they belong.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. I share that in common with all of you. It's wonderful to know when you are invited, when you're welcomed, when your presence is appreciated. And I appreciate everyone being here. You all belong in this conversation. I'm so glad to be sharing with you all today. I'm looking at one response that just came in, when one is welcome in the community. And that's actually a great transition point to our one of the big questions that will be guiding us throughout this whole conversation today. Brianna, if I could ask you to go to the next slide, please. And thinking about the idea of belonging and the topic of our time together today and the great works of art and the stories that we're going to be hearing about over the next hour or so together, is how does multiraciality complicate what we understand about representation and race? And this is something that I want to talk about with you before we get started looking at artwork together. And we're going to be looking at a drawing of Isamu Noguchi from around 1929 and a movie poster of Nancy Kwan around 1960. But before we begin, I want to share how we're defining some of these key terms for this talk, specifically race, representation, and multiraciality. You're going to be hearing some varied terms about what it means to be multiracial or mixed race. Let's start with race. The National Museum of African American History and Culture's Talking About Race portal shares that race is a social construct designed to divide people into groups ranked as superior and inferior. The scientific consensus is that race, in this sense, has no biological basis. Racial identity, however, is real, and everyone in the US has a racial identity. With the meaning of representation, we're going to look at how it's defined when it comes to media studies, because media is going to be a big part of what we're talking about today. Representation is how media portrays groups, communities, experiences, genders, ethnicities, races to an audience. And finally, multiraciality is used to discuss people of more than one racial group. This dialogue is focused on experiences of multiracial people who are of white and East Asian descent. Their experiences and mine are not representative of all multiracial or mixed race communities. To share my own positionality in this topic, I identify as a multiracial second-generation Korean American woman. Others with a similar ethnic makeup may not identify as such. So I encourage folks to honor how one identifies, allow multiple boxes to be checked. Oftentimes in media, multiracial individuals are assigned the assumption of being solutions to racial tensions, but history has shown that mixed race has always been riddled with complicated issues of acceptance and belonging. Throughout American history, mixed people have existed in an in-between. Mixed children were born from sexual assault, enslavement, military occupation abroad, and anti-miscegenation laws were in place for decades forbidding mixed marriages. In 1967, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled that laws banning interracial marriage violates the 14th Amendment. This came after Mildred Jeter, a Black woman, and Richard Loving, a white man, married in Washington, D.C. in 1958. Upon returning into their home in Virginia, they were found guilty of violating the state's anti-miscegenation statute and jailed for 1 year. Histories and stories of mixed marriages and mixed race children span race, ethnicity, religion, class, and ability. While there are stories of trauma and violence, there are also stories of joy and celebration. Not all mixed race people come from stories of trauma, and not all come from stories of love. There are struggles, privileges, access, exclusion, and inclusion. So thank you all for being here with us today for this dialogue, and I look forward to engaging with you as we begin to look at artwork together.
Andrea, thank you. So to kick us off, we are going to start with that 1929 pastel on paper portrait of Isamu Noguchi. What I'd like you to do is just take a few moments to allow your eyes to wander over this portrait. And I'll explain as you're looking a little bit about what we're going to be doing, because you see on the screen that it says close looking 10 times 2. And what that means is in just a few moments, I'm actually going to take the image off of the screen and I'm going to ask you all to go ahead and share in the chat some visual observations that you have about this portrait. And those observations, those sort of elements that you see range from color to clothing to hairstyle to scale to medium. So these observations are the visual clues that you see within this portrait. And then it's a ×2 because I'm going to bring the portrait back. And then you're going to have an opportunity to add additional observations into the chat. So the 10 is 10 observations. For our purposes this evening, it really is just about you all sharing your thoughts, your observations about what you see in this portrait. So I've talked enough. Just take another moment and look closely, top to bottom, side to side, all around. And Ashley has shared the link to the image in the chat in case you want to be able to take a closer look than what you're able to see on your screen with us. So now I'm going to take the image off the screen and I'm going to ask you all again in the chat to share your initial observations that you have about this work. And as your responses are coming in, I'm just going to tell you a little bit of context about the portrait that we were taking a look at. So Isamu Noguchi was born in 1904, and he was born in Los Angeles, California. So he is considered to be really one of the preeminent sculptors of the 20th century, but he was also a landscape architect, which was something I found fascinating about him that I didn't know before we started researching for this particular program. So when the portrait was created, Nuguchi was supporting himself by sculpting portraits when the German-born artist Winold Ries made the portrait that you just saw on the screen. And Ries was interested in the mixed ethnicities that he encountered when he was in the US. He has a whole series of portraits of individuals related to the Harlem Renaissance, but a few years after that in 1926, he created a series of portraits of Chinese and Japanese immigrants for a special issue of the Survey magazine. And it's thought that this portrait that we're taking a look at this evening actually may have been some sort of offshoot of that project, or it also could have been just a mark of friendship because Ries's Greenwich Village studio, basically, how do I say this? It was party central for artists and writers during the 1920s, and Noguchi was somebody who was there often. So I'm going to bring the image back on the screen, and I'm going to ask Irina to call out some of the responses that she saw in the chat.
Yeah, a lot of people are noticing the facial expression, specifically the eyes. I see adjectives describing his gaze as direct, as piercing. Also noticing the facial features described as pleasant or soft. A lot of people are noticing the use of the pastel, which might make it soft, the loose clothing and the loose tie with the wavy hair, in contrast to the geometric shapes in the background. some people are describing the shapes as pyramids versus the waves in his hair. Contemplative, describing his expression. Someone is noticing his biraciality. He looks ethereal.
Excellent. I'm also seeing notes about this idea of Art Nouveau or Cubist background. As you've been hearing participants' responses, I would encourage you to add in additional observations that you're making as we're looking at this portrait again. One response struck me, this idea of transparent, right? Perhaps the way that Reese is creating this pastel, we see the lines within the suit that's sort of giving us a little bit of transparency, and the same with the geometric patterns that are in the background. Excellent. So again, please do keep those observations coming in. And Irina, I will ask you to call out a few more in just a little bit, but some of the responses that I'm seeing really, I think, lend itself to really the context, I think, of Reese's work. And so, you know, you all have said Art Nouveau, and this very much has an Art Deco background to it. And it places Noguchi within the context of transnational modernism, which really was a cutting edge style that fused many different cultures into something that I think was exciting and new at the time. And so I wonder where you see that excitement, that newness, or that sense of vibrancy within this portrait. And please feel free to share those responses in the chat. And Irina, was there anything else new that was coming through?
A lot of people are sharing maybe how this portrait is making them feel, a sense of vulnerability, the intent behind it. A lot of people are noticing the contrast again between the background and Isamu Noguchi himself.
Excellent. And I think that that idea of vulnerability definitely comes through when we think about his gaze. And the fact that he is, it feels, at least to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have different views, that he is engaged with us, right, as the viewer of the portrait. And so it draws us in, but I think it also draws him out. So it sort of helps to enable some sort of connection, I think, between us and him as we are taking a look at this particular image. So at the time that this portrait was created, Noguchi had just returned from Paris on a Guggenheim Fellowship. And in his grant application, he had stated how he planned to reconcile his dual ethnicity through art. And he's quoted as saying, "My father has long been known as an interpreter of the East to the West through poetry, and I wish to do the same with sculpture." And so I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to talk a little bit more about Noguchi's life and really the context of his life as it relates to our essential question for this evening.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Brianna, and thank you all for sharing your observations of this painting. This is one of my favorite portraits. Whenever I have a chance to see it in person, or even digitally, of course, I always try and spend some time with it because I find it so interesting. And I find Isamu Noguchi to be a really interesting person in history. Excuse me, Isamu Noguchi was straddling two worlds his entire life. He has traveled the world, and he has had incredible relationships with incredible artists that we know very well when we think about art history. But while as a young person in Japan, he was seen as a foreigner, even though his father was Japanese. He was, as he said in an interview, an appendage on a stranger. In 1973, there's an interview in the American Art Archives from 1973 where he's talking about his time in Japan. And it was so unusual for someone of mixed race to be born around the time of his birth that it made the news. There was a news article announcing his birth. But when he went to Japan, he said, people talk about the discrimination. Actually, no, I'm going to take that step back. He was reflecting on his childhood, about his time in Japan as a young person, and he was sharing this with the interviewer in 1973. He said, people talk about the discrimination that exists against half-breeds, and it is probably so. I can't say that I experienced discrimination as such. A third person looking at it more objectively would probably say that it's a classical case. I, for instance, have never felt discriminated against in this country either, being the US, for that matter, but somebody else looking at it might say, well, but you didn't realize that is evidence of discrimination. And my own attitude, of course, is another question. Am I really free? Or am I really inherently self-protective against incipient discrimination? So he spends his time as a young person in Japan talking about being an appendage on a stranger. He was with his white mother and Japanese father living separately from each other for a very long time. So fast forward to him as a young adult. It's World War II in the United States. During his life in the US during this time, he witnessed the incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. And he volunteered to go into a Japanese American incarceration camp. His aim in going into the camp was to work with the government to improve the conditions of life in camp. So in that same interview from 1973, and reflecting on this time, he shared, I went to Washington and went around inquiring if there was anything I could do. I went to the State Department. They said, no, go away. There's nothing you can do. You're the last person we want to see. You're a half-breed. What do we want to do with you? He connected with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to figure out what he could do and was sent to the Poston War Relocation Camp in Arizona. This decision, which had very privileged intentions, was to create art classes and recreational activities for incarcerees in camp. There are maps of planning out zoos and workshops and creative spaces to improve the everyday living conditions of this very difficult life in camp. But these things did not go according to plan. He was not able to really easily leave the camps. His original intention was to stay in for about 2 months, and he ended up staying in camps for up to 7 months. And once he was able to finally leave Poston after his 7-month time, he experienced a lot of difficulties and discrimination navigating society as a former internee. And I have read in some instances that this sort of frustration and anger can be seen in some of his sculptural work. And when I think about his time and the decisions that he made and the way he's been able to navigate the world in his life, I just wonder when I look at this portrait, the look in his eye and the choices that were made in designing this incredible picture. So in thinking about our essential question, I have a follow-up question to help us think about this is who determines belonging? And how did Isamu Noguchi navigate his dualities and diametrically opposed worlds? If you want to share some ideas on who determines belonging, feel free to put them in the chat or just spend some time thinking about it. I'm glad we're thinking about this question of who determines belonging and thinking about even what everyone here shared about how do you know when you belong? Because the next person we're going to hear, we're going to learn more about belonging is a very central theme as well.
Madeline has shared in the chat the dominant class or the group, depending on the context, the pressure of society. Someone said it's very personal or it's fluid. It can depend often on the influence and the behavior and opinions of those around you. Someone's talking about the legality. Someone says this is a hard question, which I think is a good answer.
Right, and that it's probably a combination of you and your surroundings, right? And another fluid.
Yeah. I appreciate what someone shared about you think you belong, or you know that you belong until someone points out that you don't, and how that can happen. Because we hear about Isamu Noguchi as a young child kind of having this very strong self-awareness of being different and not really belonging, being a foreigner, and then coming into this country where he also has heritage and a sense of home, perhaps being told, no, you don't belong either.
Yeah, Andrea, to your point, someone has put in the chat, I think it might be easier to say who doesn't determine belonging rather than it is to say who does.
I love that. Yeah.
There's a lot of really great responses coming through in the chat, and I admit I'm totally getting caught up in them. Right, and this idea of sometimes you have a connection to a place that might actually override another's judgment on whether or not you should be wherever you are. These are all great. So hang on to this idea of who determines belonging, because we're gonna, as we continue to go through, we'll keep coming back to this idea of belonging throughout this program. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to step away from Isamu Noguchi. Oh, excuse me. There we go. And we're going to take a look at a portrait of Nancy Kwan. And so for this close look, what I'd like to do is facilitate what we call a See Wonder Connect. And really what that means is we're going to take a little bit of time sharing the observations that we have about the poster that you see on the screen. I'm going to give you all an opportunity as you are sharing those observations to also share questions that you have. And so those questions are your wonderings. And then we're going to connect it to another image. And I gave it away just a little bit by skipping too far ahead, but we'll take a look at another movie poster of Nancy Kwan of The World of Susie Wong as well. So as you are taking a close look, remember the visual clues that we discussed when we were looking at Noguchi's portrait. So as you're thinking, consider the pose, the expression, the clothing, the hairstyle, what you might see in the setting, the words that are on this poster. And when you're ready, share those observations in the chat. And while you all are doing that, I'm just going to share a little bit of context about what we are seeing. So Nancy Kwan was born in 1939 in Hong Kong, and she is an actress who has definitely broken barriers and played many roles throughout her lifetime. Again, when I was researching and learning more about her life, she is alive and still working. So this poster that you see in front of you, though, is from the 1960 film, The World of Susie Wong. And it really heralds the acting debut of Nancy Kwan. So in this movie, she plays a Chinese prostitute in Hong Kong who falls in love with an American painter played by the actor William Holden. Okay. So please do keep those observations coming in. Irina, what are you seeing coming through in the chat?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of recognition of the languages in this poster, both the print, the white print on the red at the bottom, and the language written in the back of Susie Wong. I'm seeing recognition of the dress and what kind of clothing Susie Wong might be wearing. Seeing some questions about her age, how old she might be.
Okay, excellent. So I love that you all are combining your initial observations with wonderings that you have about this particular image. Please do keep them coming. So in reference to the words that we see at the bottom of this particular poster, this poster is for the Spanish version of the film. And so we're seeing that the poster is really focusing in on Nancy Kwan as Susie Wong. Nancy Kwan is a woman of Chinese Scottish descent, but we're getting hints right here and there about how the producers of the film are perpetuating stereotypes. With the clothing that she's wearing, the backdrop with the Chinese characters. And yet it is still very much just a singular focus on Nancy Kwan versus not having any focus on any of the other actors that were in this particular movie. So let us-
The world, I hate to interrupt, but the world of Susie Wong isn't coming up on my screen. It's just a black screen.
So, Anne, in the chat, Ashley had added in a link to view the object, but I'm going to move us right along. So we have both posters side by side. I hope that you see them now. Okay, excellent, excellent. So let's begin to connect these two posters. So we have the poster on the right, as I said, which showcases the Spanish version of this particular movie. And then on the left, we have the Hollywood poster. So what sorts of comparisons can we begin to make as we look at both of these images? And please do feel free to share your responses in the chat. What sorts of comparisons, connections can we make between these two?
So someone in the chat says she seems to have more agency in the poster on the right-hand side. Sorry, there are a lot of answers coming in. So again, Nancy Kwan is central in the poster on the right, whereas on the left, the character of Susie Wong is sharing the poster with someone else. The poster on the left emphasizes sex and seductiveness. The poster on the left is also idealized.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. So before I turn it over to Andrea, I just want to close out our looking at these two images by noting that this particular film was one of the first major movies to depict an interracial relationship. And therefore acknowledge the different ways that Asians are represented within American popular culture. And so I'm going to shift gears, pass it over to Andrea to give us a little bit more context about Nancy Kwan, and again to relate this back to the ideas of belonging that we've been discussing.
Yeah, thank you, Brianna. Thank you for walking us through these two images. They're so stark, aren't they? The differences between the two for the same film. And thank you all for sharing. It's been so interesting to read through the comments in the chat here. So Nancy Kwan is someone that, the name Nancy Kwan has been in my life for a very long time. There aren't many mixed race people I could look up to, especially when I was a kid. I always knew about Nancy Kwan. My parents always made sure that I knew who she was, because it was Nancy Kwan and Keanu Reeves were my mixed race heroes growing up as a kid. But Nancy Kwan's story is an interesting one at the intersection of gender and race in Hollywood. So for the role of Susie Wong, she was sought after for not appearing too Asian on film, while acting in a role that unfortunately perpetuated harmful stereotypes that women of Asian descent face even today, being submissive, hypersexualized, or the dragon lady stereotype, which often women of East and Southeast Asian descent face, which is the dragon lady is seen as someone being deceitful and mysterious. So landing a leading role was a very big deal for an Asian American woman around this time, especially since most leading Asian characters before Susie Wong were played by white actors in yellowface. Before Nancy Kwan, there was, of course, Anna May Wong, the first major Asian American movie star. So while Susie Wong signaled a growing change in Hollywood with the acceptance of an Asian American leading woman, again, who was seen as not too Asian, being that being a benefit for the production of this film, there was backlash from the Asian American community on these portrayals. People were offended about the role's perpetuation of stereotypes and sexualization, and Nancy Kwan's role in other films, such as film Flower Drum Song, where she played a showgirl named Linda Lowe, didn't make things any better. Much later, more recently, I would say, Nancy was interviewed and she's quoted saying, "I guess they blamed me for that image." Yes, the image of playing a prostitute or a showgirl. The first time I heard it, I thought, well, if she had been a nun, it would have been a whole different thing. But because she was a prostitute, they thought that every Asian woman was a Susie Wong. You can see this in the American poster of the very different portrayal of her and her body. So Nancy Kwan was born in Hong Kong and went to school in England. In a 2018 interview, she said, "I'm Eurasian. My father's Chinese and my mother's English. So I have two cultures. I grew up speaking two languages, living in two cultures. I adapted well perhaps because of that. I just don't really fit in anywhere, but I'll just have to make it happen. I'll just be a part of it." So similar to Isamu Noguchi, of course, straddling two very different worlds and these two different cultures that they are embodying. Throughout her career, she took on roles that boosted her career. She won a Golden Globe for her role as Susie Wong. But while her career advanced from roles that perpetuated Asian stereotypes, she also benefited from opportunities for not appearing again too Asian. So in this instance, another question, what is the cost of belonging? What is sacrificed?
It's such a hard question to answer, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
People are saying identity, assimilation, one's true self, being pushed into a particular niche. The identity is coming up again. Self-respect or the respect of others.
And this idea of being your authentic self, right? And possibly losing that.
Yeah.
Or
I think
alienation
about,
from.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Andrea.
Alienation from your community. Brianna, something that you observed that I also saw in the chat is thinking about authenticity, how difficult that can be. Personally speaking, I don't know, for me, being my authentic self means embracing my cultures, my many cultures, where I come from, which is from many different parts of the world. But kind of back to the last question we were discussing with the Isamu Noguchi portrait is there are times where I go into a space where I know that I have something in common with everyone in this room. We are from the same country. We are, we have heritage together. And yet I still don't belong, you know? So while for me, it's my authentic self that I claim that I belong and I feel like I'm here, you have to negotiate with yourself sometimes. It could be very uncomfortable. And I think for authenticity, there are also these indicators of how you belong, how someone can determine if you belong, how well you speak the language, how you eat, what you eat, your mannerisms, you know, slang even. There are these small things that I think people read as a way to determine your belonging or to validate it somehow and invalidate it as well. And, you know, when I think about Nancy Kwan, I feel so much for her because, you know, she's wanting to make it big in Hollywood. She wants this career, but it comes at the sacrifice of offending, you know, people that she has an affinity with.
Right. Thank you. And, you know, I would encourage everybody, even though we're going to move on and start connecting these two images, these two stories, to continue to read all of your really thoughtful responses in the chat, and to keep those coming. So let's bring them together. So we have these two portraits of Isamu Noguchi and of Nancy Kwan. Let's start to think about the kinds of connections that we can make. We can certainly start to think about connections between the two objects themselves, but I would also encourage everyone to start thinking about the kinds of connections that we can be making between the subjects and their lived experiences. So I invite you to share your responses in the chat. What sorts of connections can we make between these objects, the subjects, and their lived experiences?
Someone just added to the chat that their eyes are the most compelling feature in both of these images. They look tentative and questioning.
And I would certainly, you know, add as well, just there is this level of engagement, right, that we see because they are, again, both engaged with the viewer. And Amelia's noting also determination in their eyes as well.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people pick up on maybe the similarities of their facial expressions, whether that's determination or sadness or a fight.
Right, and so this idea of a fight, right, really starts to, I think, take us into their lived experiences, into their biography, and what those experiences were, right, during their lifetime, and what sorts of, you know, comparisons we can make between those.
Someone noticed the contrast in both of these portraits between the sitter and what's behind them, and that both of these backgrounds are contrasted. Someone says that Kwan's background is earthy and Noguchi's background is ethereal. I'm seeing a lot of adjectives describing the portraits: confident, intent, focused outward. Connections between their mouths. Someone is saying that they think that their outsidedness is prevailing in these images.
And yet, right, there is this sense of, when you think about their stories, of being driven, right? Cheryl makes an excellent point about, the image that we see of Nancy Kwan. And I do think, right, we talked a little bit about agency with this image, this poster versus the other one. There isn't really a way for us to know, how much agency she had in this representation. But I think, again, when you look at both posters side by side, it is a very different representation of her. Thank you all for these responses as we begin to build connections between these two subjects.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing. This is so interesting. And I'm seeing things differently now that I see these portraits side by side. Things I had not noticed before, I'm noticing now. So thank you all for sharing. And thinking about these portraits and these stories and the idea of multiraciality today, how do these historical objects and the events around them, how do they relate to current events? So look forward to seeing ideas and responses in the chat. And we think about how these stories connect with what's happening today. I want to share some information about some of the data that's been coming out around the growth of multiracial communities in this country. So in a fairly recent Pew report from Pew Research Group, multiracial and Hispanic Asians comprise 14% and 3% of the Asian population in the US. Those who identify as Asian and white make up a large majority, 70%. And of the 19 origin groups included in this analysis, Japanese Americans are most likely to identify as multiracial non-Hispanic, 32% do so. And around 1 in 5 Filipinos, around 18%, and 15% of Koreans also identify as multiracial non-Hispanic. And there are some news recently, as more data comes out from the census, these numbers might be changing. So look out for new reports about our changing demographics in the US. Sadly, and this was mentioned early in the acknowledgement, I want to thank the National Portrait Gallery for adding this. There has been a rise in anti-Asian racism due to COVID-19, but this is not new, this rise of anti-Asian racism. That has been a part of this country's history for a very long time. The group Stop AAPI Hate and the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum did a joint report very recently in the spring and shared that from March 2020 to March 2021, so for one full year, 6.7% of multiracial women reported hate incidents during the pandemic. There are so many sad stories, and with the rise of this hate and violence, there are many multiracial people, women, men, and unfortunately young children who are experiencing this hate and this violence. And when we think back to some of the stories we learned about through Isamu Noguchi, his time in the incarceration camps, but then also a lot of the hypersexualization that Nancy Kwan had to live through, a lot of these stereotypes and a lot of this determination of who belongs, it continues even today. So when I look at the chat here, I see there's a lot of activity here. Ashley, thank you for adding the links to the reports. I'll look at some of the comments here.
Yeah, someone is responding to your questions about current events and saying that roles are still very much stereotyped in media and that racism is still prevalent. And then there are people responding to maybe the original question of belonging and that there is a large lack of belonging. That's a major issue in the US today.
Thank you all so much for sharing. And I appreciate everyone sharing in this conversation. And Brianna and I are going to be chatting a bit more about this idea of belonging and what does it take to belong. I think that's something that I appreciate that we're all asking ourselves this and sharing it. And I don't know, Brianna, but when I think about Isamu Noguchi, I think about Nancy Kwan, I think about what does it take to belong. I think what it takes maybe for them, what I take away from thinking about their personal stories and their journey is that sometimes what it takes is time and a determination to decide that you're going to live your life the way you want to live it. And there will always be these factors around you that are determining it for you on your behalf, or in some cases making that decision for you, or you making that decision for yourself and kind of arriving at a time and place where you say, no, I'm here, I'm a part of this.
Right, and I was thinking about this idea of right, of effort, and you know, what does that effort look like? I mean, do you reach a point where, you know, you do say that I am my most authentic self, and you know, come what may, or is it always, I keep going back to this idea that you just said, right, this idea of determination, and we've been seeing that word come up in the chat throughout our conversation. It's tricky. I mean, this whole idea of sort of identifying what belonging looks like, who gets to make those decisions, what it takes to belong. I think that there's no one way, right? I mean, each of us, you know, are living, you know, a unique path, if you will, and so everybody's experience, I think, winds up being a little bit different.
Absolutely. I want to share a comment that was just posted in the chat. Sometimes acceptance will be obtainable, so you must live your own authentic self. It's, you know, I'm kind of like stumbling on my own words here because there's so much that we can say. And thinking about the context of our talk together is, you know, how do we see multiraciality complicating what we understand about representation and race? And I invite the audience to share ideas in the chat as well. It's like knowing more about Isamu Noguchi, knowing more about Nancy Kwan, but not knowing everything. They have both lived very interesting lives. How would you answer this question? Knowing what you have now learned over the course of this time together, how might multiraciality complicate representation and race?
And as everyone is pondering this very big question as we close out our program, I am seeing some additional responses in the chat, which I just do want to call out about this idea of what does it take to belong, and how, you know, Duke is noting that, you know, you have to base it on your own self, your family, your experiences, and sometimes things are just outside and beyond, right, our own control. And John mentions that belonging is a journey.
I appreciate that, John. We're all on that journey. I definitely am, yeah.
I see Joan has responded to the question in that's being shared, and she says, similar to gender, the historical desire to put into neat categories, but the reality is so much more complex and richer. Gender and race are outdated notions, question mark.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, our understandings, our vocabulary, the language that we use, the ways we choose to identify our gender and our race, they're changing all the time. And I love meeting someone who says, and this is in critical mixed race study circles that I often run in, oftentimes a question that someone who is racially ambiguous will get asked is, what are you? And that's always I have been asked that many times. I imagine Osama Noguchi and Nancy Kwan to some degree were also asked that. That's always a very stark question. And I think while I at least understand what people are asking, I love meeting with folks who are also of mixed race heritage saying, not what are you, but who are you? And I love that simple switch because we're all humans and we all have very different stories to tell. And yes, Barbara, where are you from? That can be very coded. That can open up all sorts of things that someone may not want to talk about, you know, and it can be very, you know, I think that there's this human nature of being curious. And I think to what Joan was saying, there is this tendency, I think it's a uniquely American thing. I could be wrong, but in my times abroad, you know, and coming back here, there's always this emphasis on your race, you know, what box can I put you in so that I know? And I understand that human curiosity, but it can be very challenging depending on who's receiving those questions, on how they want to respond. What's the story that they want to tell, that they're willing to tell? And it can be very, at times, it can be a pleasant conversation. At times, it could be a very challenging one. I've been a museum educator for about 13 years now. And before coming to the Smithsonian, I worked at an Asian Pacific American museum. And I was asked that all the time when I was giving tours. Before anything else, what are you? And it's like, well, I'm a human being. We both are. We have that in common. But I understand the curiosity and the intention behind it.
Yeah, there's some great things in the chat. Someone said that she's in her school district, students need to identify in ways that they don't necessarily check a box, and that we could address multiraciality by allowing students to identify themselves. Someone else has said a genealogist told her that her family was making the research harder for future genealogists because her sister identifies as Black and my father and I identify as Black and Native American, and that now the genealogist comment bothered them.
Yeah. Allison, thank you for sharing. I'm very sorry to hear that. Yeah. These questions are, they're very difficult. And then when you start to learn, if you want to research more about your mixed multiracial heritage, there are painful stories. There can also be very joyful stories. I know for me, I have there is a block between me and learning more about my family in Korea. And a lot of it has to do, not due to a lack of resources, but because my mother was born right after the Korean War. And for a lot of girls, they don't receive a lot of the family genealogical papers. And so I have to rely on her memory of what she remembers, but because her childhood was so difficult, there's really no strong connection. And so that sense of belonging for me personally is one of wonder, and trying to figure out what more I could access to learn more. And then the question is, well, I want to learn more. I have to go on that journey with my mother, where we both have very different emotional attachments to that journey.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation, a very thoughtful conversation. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your ideas, for sharing your questions with us over the past hour. I did just want to highlight very quickly that Ashley has placed into the chat a series of links that take you to events that are hosted by both the Portrait Gallery as well as the Asian Pacific American Center. The Asian Pacific American Center's learning page, which is a phenomenal resource. I would encourage everybody to go to it. And then if you're interested in more programs by both of us, you can sign up for our newsletters. In Dialogue is a monthly program. And so you will see on our Eventbrite page that our programs for September, October, and November are already there. And we would certainly love for you to join us for another program where we partner with another Smithsonian museum or unit to, again, dive into these conversations. So with that, thank you everyone for spending the last hour with us. Andrea, do you have any final closing words?
I want to thank everyone. I want to thank my friends at the National Portrait Gallery. I want to thank all of you for attending. This has been such a personal joy to be a part of this conversation. And thank you all for your honesty, for sharing your ideas and questions. It was a pleasure and an honor to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you again at a program soon.